Welcome to disc number 3 of the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership by John C. Maxwell. Copyright 2007, published by Thomas Nelson.
Law number 15, the law of victory. Leaders find a way for the team to win. Have you ever thought about what separates the leaders who achieve victory from those who suffer defeat? I think that victorious leaders have one thing in common. They share an unwillingness to accept defeat. The alternative to winning is totally unacceptable to them. As a result, they figure out what must be done to achieve victory. Crisis seems to bring out the best and the worst in leaders because at such times the pressure is intense and the stakes are high. That was certainly true during World War II when Adolf Hitler was threatening to crush Europe and remake it according to his vision. But against the power of Hitler and his Nazi hordes stood a leader determined to win, a practitioner of the law of victory, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He inspired the British people to resist Hitler and ultimately win the war. Winston Churchill was a courageous leader who had practiced the law of victory throughout his life. He refused to buckle under the Nazis' threats. For more than a year, Great Britain stood alone, facing the threat of German invasion. When Hitler indicated that he wanted to make a deal with England, Churchill defied him. When Germany began bombing England, the British stood strong, and all the while Churchill looked for a way to gain victory. Time after time, Churchill rallied the British people. It began with his first speech after becoming Prime Minister, in which he said, "We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I can say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all cost. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival." When Churchill sought the aid of Franklin Roosevelt, he was enlisting a leader who had practiced the law of victory for decades. It was a hallmark of Roosevelt's entire life. He had found a way to achieve political victory while winning over polio. When he was elected president and became responsible for pulling the American people out of the Great Depression, it was just another impossible situation that he learned how to fight through. And fight he did. Through the 1930s, the country was slowly recovering, due in a large part to his leadership. To Churchill and Roosevelt, victory was the only option. If they had accepted anything less, the world would be a very different place today. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. noted, "Take a look at our present world. It is manifestly not Adolf Hitler's world. His 1,000-year Reich turned out to have a brief and bloody run of a dozen years. It is manifestly not Joseph Stalin's world. That ghastly world self-destructed before our eyes. Without Churchill and England, all of Europe would have fallen. Without Roosevelt and the United States, it might never have been reclaimed for freedom. But not even an Adolf Hitler and the army of the Third Reich could stand against two leaders dedicated to the law of victory. Whether it's a sports team, an army, a business, or a nonprofit organization, victory is possible as long as you have three components that contribute to a team's dedication to victory. Number one, unity of vision. Teams succeed only when the players have a unified vision, no matter how much talent or potential there is. A team doesn't win the championship if its players are working from different agendas. That's true in professional sports. That's true in business. That's true in nonprofits. Number two, diversity of skills. It almost goes without saying that a team needs diversity in skills. Can you imagine a whole hockey team of goalies or a football team of quarterbacks? How about a business where there are only salespeople or nothing but accountants, or a nonprofit organization with just fundraisers, or only strategists. It doesn't make sense. Every organization requires diverse talents to succeed. Number 3, a leader dedicated to victory and raising players to their potential. It's true that having good players with diverse skills is important. As former Notre Dame head football coach Lou Holtz says, "You've got to have great athletes to win. I don't care who the coach is. You can't win without good athletes, but you can lose with them." This is where coaching makes the difference. In other words, you also require leadership to achieve victory. Unity of vision doesn't happen spontaneously. The right players with the proper diversity of talent don't come together on their own. It takes a leader to make those things happen. It takes a leader to provide the motivation, empowerment, and direction required to win. One of the most noteworthy success stories I've come across is that of Southwest Airlines' Herb Kelleher, whom I mentioned in the chapter on the law of connection. The company's story is an admirable example of the law of victory in action. Today, Southwest looks like a powerhouse that has everything going for it. In the routes where it flies, it dominates the market. The company is on a steady growth curve, and its stock performs extremely well. It is the only U.S. airline that has earned a profit every year since 1973, even as other airlines have gone bankrupt and disappeared. It is the only airline that has thrived in the wake of 9/11. Employees love working there. Turnover is extremely low, and the company is considered to have the most productive workforce in the industry. And it's extremely popular with customers. Southwest gets consistently superior customer service ratings. It has maintained the fewest overall customer service complaints in the industry since 1987. Given Southwest's current position, you might think it has always been a powerhouse. That's not the case. In fact, it's a testament to the law of victory that the company even exists today. The airline was begun in 1967 by Roland Keene, owner of a small commuter air service in Texas, John Parker, a banker, and Herb Kelleher, an attorney. But it took them 4 years to get their first plane off the ground. And as soon as the company incorporated, Braniff, Trans-Texas, and Continental Airlines all tried to put it out of business. And they almost succeeded. One court battle followed another, and one man more than any other made the fight his own, Herb Kelleher. When their startup capital was gone and they seemed to be defeated, the board wanted to give up. However, Kelleher said, "Let's go one more round with them. I will continue to represent the company in court, and I'll postpone any legal fees and pay every cent of the court cost out of my own pocket." Finally, when their case made it to the Texas Supreme Court, the trio won, and they were at last able to put their planes in the air. Once it got going, Southwest hired experienced airline leader Lamar Muse as its new CEO. He in turn hired the best executives available. And as other airlines kept trying to put them out of business, Kelleher and Muse kept fighting in court and in the marketplace. When they had trouble filling their planes going to and from Houston, Southwest began flying into Houston's Hobby Airport, which is more accessible to commuters because of its proximity to downtown. When all the major carriers moved to the newly created Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, Southwest kept flying into convenient Love Field. When the airline had to sell one of its 4 planes to survive, the executives figured out a way for their remaining planes to be on the ground no longer than an amazingly short 10 minutes between flights. That way, Southwest could maintain routes and schedules. And when they couldn't figure out any other way to fill their planes, they pioneered peak and off-peak pricing, giving leisure travelers a huge break in the cost of fares. Through it all, Kelleher kept fighting and helped keep Southwest alive. In 1978, 7 years after he helped put the company's first small fleet of planes into the air, he became chairman of the company. In 1982, he was made president and CEO. Today, he serves as executive chairman of the board. He and his colleagues continue to fight and find ways for the company to win. Southwest's president, Colleen Barrett, sums it up. The warrior mentality, the very fight to survive, is truly what created our culture. What Kelleher, Barrett, and the rest of the Southwest leadership team have is not just a will to survive, but a will to win. Leaders who practice the law of victory believe that anything less than success is unacceptable. They have no plan B. That is why they keep fighting, and it's why they continue to win. What is your level of expectation when it comes to succeeding for your organization? How dedicated are you to winning your game? Are you going to have the law of victory in your corner as you fight, or when times get difficult, are you going to throw in the towel? Your answer to that question may determine whether you succeed or fail as a leader, and whether your team wins or loses. Law number 16, the law of the Big Mo. Momentum is a leader's best friend. If ever there was a person with talent and vision, it was Ed Catmull. In 1979, filmmaker George Lucas hired Catmull to run the computer graphics division of Lucasfilm Limited. Catmull tried to convince Lucas to let him try to make computer-generated feature films, but the technology was still in its early stages and too expensive. Instead, Lucas decided to sell the division. In 1986, Steve Jobs bought it by paying $5 million for it and putting an additional $5 million into the company. He named it Pixar. While it was struggling to become profitable, Pixar began making short films to demonstrate the power of its technology. The first was called Luxo Jr. It shows two animated desk lamps interacting as a parent and a child would. Luxo Jr. was so good that it was nominated for an Academy Award. But Catmull and his team were still a long way from achieving his dream of creating a full-length feature film. The company's greatest challenge at that time was merely surviving. Then in 1991, because of the credibility Pixar had earned, it got a significant break. The leaders thought the company was ready to take its next big step, creating a one-hour television special. John Lasseter, an animator who teamed up with Catmull, approached Disney, his former employer, to pitch the idea. The response amazed him. Disney offered a contract to create 3 full-length feature movies using computer animation. Disney would fund and distribute the projects. Pixar would create them and receive a percentage of the profits. Pixar finally had an opportunity to fulfill Catmull's vision, but the company was still far from realizing it. The company got to work on what would become Toy Story, but the team had trouble with the characters and the story. It would take Pixar 4 years to make the movie. Though the rest of the world wasn't seeing it yet, Pixar was starting to develop momentum. That became obvious to everyone when Toy Story opened in November 1995. When the contract with Disney was signed 4 years earlier, Pixar's CEO Stephen Jobs estimated that if the first movie was a modest hit, say $75 million at the box office, we'll both break even. If it gets $100 million, we'll both make money. But if it's a real blockbuster and earns $200 million or so at the box office, we'll make good money and Disney will make a lot of money. Few people would have predicted that it would make $192 million domestically and $362 million worldwide. From that time, Pixar's momentum has been strong and, if anything, has continued to grow. The organization has won 17 Oscars and been awarded 42 patents. And since Toy Story came out, the company has produced hit after hit: A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, and Cars. Worldwide, those movies have earned more than $3.67 billion. Ironically, while Pixar was gaining momentum, Disney, the company who helped it create its breakthrough, was losing momentum. Disney's animation division had fallen on hard times. Its last significant animated movie was Lilo and Stitch in 2002, and it had produced 3 highly expensive bombs: Atlantis, Treasure Planet, and Home on the Range. How could Disney possibly regain some momentum? Bob Iger, who became Disney's president and CEO in October 2005, knew how. He purchased Pixar. Now the people Disney once helped were helping Disney. Catmull became Disney's president of feature animation, and Lasseter was made chief creative officer. Disney has had 2 major heydays, says Catmull. We're going to make a third. And what about Pixar? It will continue to function as before under the care of Catmull and Lassiter. When you've got great momentum, you don't want to do anything to get in its way. After all, momentum is a leader's best friend. Many times, it's the only thing that makes the difference between losing and winning. When you have no momentum, even the simplest tasks seem impossible. Small problems look like insurmountable obstacles. Morale becomes low. The future appears dark. An organization with no momentum is like a train at a dead stop. It's hard to get going, and even small wooden blocks on the track can keep it from going anywhere. On the other hand, when you have momentum on your side, the future looks bright. Obstacles appear small, and troubles seem inconsequential. An organization with momentum is like a train that's moving 60 miles per hour. You could build a steel-reinforced concrete wall across the tracks, and the train would plow right through it. When leadership is strong and there is momentum in an organization, people are motivated and inspired to perform at higher levels. They become effective beyond their hopes and expectations. If you remember the 1980 U.S. Olympic hockey team, you know what I'm talking about. The team was good, but not good enough to win the gold medal. Yet that's what the Americans did. Why? Because leading up to the championship game, they won game after game against very tough teams. They gained so much momentum that they performed beyond everyone's expectations. And after they beat the Russians, nothing could stop them from coming home with the gold medal. The same kind of thing is true in business and volunteer organizations. When an organization has great momentum, all participants are more successful than they would be otherwise. I'll tell you how I know that that's true. If you see leaders, especially mid-level ones, who have had great success in an organization with momentum, leave that organization and suddenly their performance becomes merely average, you know the law of the Big Mo was at work. Even average people can perform far above average in an organization with great momentum. Momentum is easier to steer than to start. Have you ever been water skiing? If you have, you know that it's harder to get up on the water than it is to steer once you're up there. It takes a leader to create momentum. Followers can catch it. Good managers are able to use it to their advantage once it has begun. Everyone can enjoy the benefits it brings, but creating momentum requires someone who has a vision, can assemble a good team and motivate others. If the leader is looking for someone to motivate him, then the organization is in trouble. If the leader is waiting for the organization to develop momentum on its own, then the organization is in trouble. It is the leader's responsibility to initiate momentum and keep it going. U.S. President Harry Truman once said, "If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen." But for leaders, that statement should be changed to, "If you can't make some heat, get out of the kitchen." If you don't believe in the vision and enthusiastically pursue it, doing all that you can to bring it to fruition, then you won't start making the small gains required to get the ball rolling. However, if you model enthusiasm to your people day in and day out, you attract like-minded people to your team, department, or organization and motivate them to achieve. You will begin to see forward progress. Once you do, you will begin to generate momentum, and if you're wise, you'll value it for what it is, the leader's best friend. Once you have it, you can do almost anything. That's the power of the Big Mo. Several years ago, I saw a movie called Stand and Deliver that illustrates the hopelessness many people feel in an organization without momentum. Maybe you've seen it too. It's about a real-life teacher named Jamie Escalante, who worked at Garfield High School in East Los Angeles, California. Teaching, motivating, and leading were in Jamie Escalante's blood, even from the time of his youth in native Bolivia. He quickly became known as his city's finest teacher. When he was in his 30s, Escalante and his family immigrated to the United States. He worked several years in a restaurant and then at Russell Electronics. Though he could have pursued a promising career at Russell, he went back to school and earned a second bachelor's degree so that he could teach in the United States. Escalante's burning desire was to make a difference in people's lives. At age 43, he was hired by Garfield High School to teach computer science. But when he arrived at Garfield on the first day of class, he found out that there was no funding for computers. And because his degree was in mathematics, he would be teaching basic math. Disappointed, He went in search of his first class, hoping that his dream of making a difference wasn't slipping through his fingers. The change from computers to math turned out to be the least of Escalante's problems. The school, which had been empty and quiet during his summertime interview, was now in chaos. Discipline was non-existent. Fights seemed to break out continually. Trash and graffiti were everywhere. Students and even outsiders from the neighborhood roamed all over the campus throughout the day. Gang activity was rampant. It was a teacher's worst nightmare. Almost daily he thought of quitting. But his passion for teaching and his dedication to improving the lives of his students wouldn't allow him to give up. Yet at the same time, Escalante was enough of a leader to know that the students were doomed if the school didn't change. They were all sliding backward fast, and they needed something to move them forward. When a new principal was brought in, things began to change for the better. But Escalante wanted to take it further. He believed that the way to improve the school was to challenge the school's best and brightest with a calculus class that would prepare them for an AP class, earning them college credit. In the fall of 1978, Escalante organized the first calculus class, rounding up every possible candidate who might be able to handle the course from Garfield's 3,500 student population. He was able to find only 14 students. In the first few classes, he laid out the work it would take for them to prepare for the AP calculus test at the end of the year. By the end of the second week of school, he had lost 7 students. Even the ones who stayed were not well prepared for calculus. And by late spring, he was down to only 5 students. All of them took the AP test in May, but only 2 passed. Escalante was disappointed, but he refused to give up, especially since he had made progress. He knew that if he could help his students experience a few wins, build their confidence, and give them hope, he could move them forward. He was determined to do whatever it took. To motivate them, he'd give them extra homework or challenge one of the school athletes to a handball match. Escalante never lost. If they needed encouragement, he'd take them out to McDonald's as a reward. If they got lazy, he'd inspire, amaze, amuse, and even intimidate them. And all along the way, he modeled hard work, dedication to excellence, and desire. The next fall, Escalante put together another calculus class, this time with 9 students. At the end of the year, 8 took the test and 6 passed. He was making progress. Word of his success spread. Students heard that Escalante's protégés were earning college credit, and in the fall of 1980, his calculus class numbered 15. When they all took the test at the end of the year, 14 students passed. The steps forward weren't huge, but Escalante could see that the program was building momentum. The next group of students, numbering 18, was the subject of the movie Stand and Deliver. Like their predecessors, they worked very hard to learn calculus, many coming to school at 7 a.m. every day, a full hour and a half before school started. And often they stayed until 5, 6, or 7 p.m. And though Educational Testing Service questioned the validity of the first test students took, they had to take it a second time. 100% of them passed. After that, the math program exploded. But the benefits of the law of the Big Mo were felt by all of the Garfield High School students. The school started offering classes to prepare students for other AP exams. In time, Garfield held regular AP classes in Spanish, calculus, history, European history, biology, physics, French, government, and computer science. In 1987, 9 years after Escalante spearheaded the program, Garfield students took more than 325 AP examinations. Most incredibly, Garfield had a waiting list of more than 400 students from areas outside its boundaries wanting to enroll. The school that was once the laughing stock of the district and that had almost lost its accreditation had become one of the top 3 inner-city schools in the entire nation. That's the power of the law of the Big Mo. Law number 17, the law of priorities. Leaders understand that activity is not necessarily accomplishment. When we are busy, we naturally believe that we are achieving. But busyness does not equal productivity. Activity is not necessarily accomplishment. Prioritizing requires leaders to continually think ahead, to know what's important, to know what's next, to see how everything relates to the overall vision. That's hard work. Prioritizing also causes us to do things that are at the least uncomfortable and sometimes downright painful. Every year I spend about 2 weeks in December reevaluating my priorities. I review the previous year's schedule. I look at my upcoming commitments. I evaluate my family life. I think about my goals. I look at the big picture of what I'm doing to make sure the way I'm living lines up with my values and priorities. One of the guiding principles I use during the process is the Pareto principle. I've often taught it to people at leadership conferences over the years, and I also explain it in depth in my book, Developing the Leader Within You. The idea is this: if you focus your attention on the activities that rank in the top 20% in terms of importance, you'll have an 80% return on your effort. For example, if you have 10 employees, you should give 80% of your time and attention to the best 2. If you have 100 customers, the top 20 will provide you with 80% of your business, so focus on them. If your to-do list has 10 items on it, the 2 most important ones will give you an 80% return on your time. If you haven't already observed this phenomenon, test it, and you'll see that it really plays out that way. One year as I went through this process, I realized that I had to totally refocus and restructure one of my organizations. The other guideline that I use whenever I evaluate my priorities is the 3 R's. No, not reading, writing, and arithmetic. My 3 R's are requirement, return, and reward. I believe that to be effective, leaders must order their lives according to these 3 questions. 1, what is required? We're all accountable to somebody for the work we do, an employer, a board of directors, stockholders, the government, and so on. We also have responsibility for the important people in our lives, such as spouse, children, and parents. For that reason, any list of priorities must begin with what is required of us. The question I ask myself is, what must I do that nobody can or should do for me? As I have gotten older, that list has gotten shorter and shorter. If I'm doing something that's not necessary, I should eliminate it. If I'm doing something that's necessary but not required of me personally, I need to delegate it. Number 2, what gives the greatest return? As a leader, you should spend most of your time working in your areas of greatest strength. Ideally, leaders should get out of their comfort zone but should stay in their strength zone. Here's my rule of thumb. If something I'm doing can be done 80% as well by someone else, I delegate it. If you have a responsibility that someone else could do according to that standard or that could potentially meet that standard, then develop and train a person to handle it. Just because you can do something does not mean that you should do it. Remember, leaders understand that activity is not necessarily accomplishment. That's the law of priorities. Number 3, what brings the greatest reward? The final question relates to personal satisfaction. Tim Redmond, president of Redmond Leadership Institute, observed, "There are many things that will catch my eye, but there are only a few things that will catch my heart. Life is too short not to do things that you love. I love to teach leadership. I love writing and speaking. I love spending time with my wife, children, my grandchildren. I love playing golf. No matter what else I do, I will make time for those things. They are the fire lighters in my life. They energize me. They keep me passionate. And passion provides the fuel in a person's life to keep him going. It is the responsibility of leaders to make tough decisions based on priorities. That can sometimes make them unpopular. Back in 1981, when Jack Welch became chairman and CEO of General Electric, it was a good company. It had a 90-year history. The company's stock traded at $4 a share, and the company was worth about $12 billion, 11th best on the stock market. It was a huge, diverse company that included 350 strategic businesses. But Welch believed the company could become better. What was his strategy? He used the law of priorities. Within a few months of taking over the company, he began what he called the hardware revolution. It changed the entire profile and focus of the company. Welch said, "To the hundreds of businesses and product lines that made up the company, we applied a single criterion. Can they be number one or number two at whatever they do in the world marketplace? Of the 348 businesses or product lines that could not, we closed some and divested others. Their sale brought in almost $10 billion. We invested $18 billion in the ones that remained and further strengthened them with $17 billion worth of acquisitions. What remained in 1989, aside from a few relatively small supporting operations, are 14 world-class businesses, all well-positioned for the 90s, each one either first or second in the world market in which it participates. I know Welch is out of favor in some circles, and recently his methods have been criticized, but his leadership was right for his time and situation. He reprioritized GE, and his strong leadership and focus paid incredible dividends. During his tenure, GE stock experienced a 2-to-1 split 4 times, and it traded at more than $80 per share when he retired. The company was ranked as the nation's most admired company, according to Fortune, and it continues to be one of the most valuable companies in the world. That came about because of Welch's ability to use the law of priorities in his leadership. He never mistook activity for accomplishment. He knew that the greatest success comes only after you focus your people on what really matters. Examine the lives of all effective leaders, and you will see them putting priorities into action. Every time Norman Schwarzkopf assumed a new command, he didn't just rely on his leadership intuition. He also re-examined the unit's priorities. Lance Armstrong was able to win 7 Tour de France championships because his priorities guided his training regimen. When explorer Roald Amundsen succeeded in taking his team to the South Pole and back, it was due in part to his ability to set right priorities. Successful leaders live according to the law of priorities. They recognize that activity is not necessarily accomplishment. Law number 18, the law of sacrifice. A leader must give up to go up. Why does an individual step forward to lead other people? For every person, the answer is different. A few do to survive. Some do it to make money. Many desire to build a business or organization. Others do it because they want to change the world. That was the reason for Martin Luther King, Jr. King accepted his first pastorate in Montgomery, Alabama, at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in 1954, and settled into family life when his first child was born the next year in November. But that peace didn't last long. Less than a month later, Rosa Parks refused to relinquish her seat on a bus to a white passenger and was arrested. Local African-American leaders arranged a one-day boycott of the transit system to protest her arrest and the city's segregation policy. When it was successful, they decided to create the Montgomery Improvement Association to continue the boycott. Already recognized as a leader in the community, King was unanimously elected president of the newly formed organization. For the next year, King led African-American community leaders in a boycott with the goal of changing the system. The MIA negotiated with city leaders and demanded courteous treatment of African Americans by bus operators, first come, first served seating for all bus riders, and employment of African American bus drivers. While the boycott was on, community leaders organized carpools, raised funds to support the boycott financially, rallied and mobilized the community with sermons, and coordinated legal challenges with the NAACP. Finally, in November 1956, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the laws allowing segregated seating on buses. King and the other leaders were successful. Their world was beginning to change. The Montgomery bus boycott was a major step in the American civil rights movement, and it's easy to see what was gained as a result of it. But King also began paying a personal cost for it. Soon after the boycott began, King was arrested for a minor traffic violation. A bomb was thrown onto his porch, and he was indicted on a charge of being party to a conspiracy to hinder and prevent the operation of business without just or legal cause. Keene was emerging as a leader, but he was paying a price for it. Each time Keene climbed higher and moved forward in leadership for the cause of civil rights, the greater the price he paid for it. His wife, Coretta Scott Keene, remarked in My Life with Martin Luther King, Jr., "Day and night our phone would ring and someone would pour out a string of obscene epithets. Frequently the calls ended with a threat to kill us if we didn't get out of town. But in spite of all the danger, the chaos of our private lives, I felt inspired, almost elated." Keene did some great things as a leader. He met with presidents, he delivered rousing speeches that are considered some of the most outstanding examples of oration in American history. He led 250,000 people in a peaceful march on Washington, D.C. He received the Nobel Peace Prize, and he did create change in this country. But the law of sacrifice demands that the greater the leader, the more he must give up. During that same period, Keene was arrested many times and jailed on many occasions. He was stoned, stabbed, and physically attacked. His house was bombed, yet his vision and his influence continued to increase. Ultimately, he sacrificed everything he had, but what he gave up, he parted with willingly. Eventually, he paid the ultimate price of sacrifice. Keene's impact was profound. He influenced millions of people to peacefully stand up against a system and society that fought to exclude them. The United States has changed for the better because of his leadership. There is a common misperception among people who aren't leaders that leadership is all about the position, perks, and power that come from rising in an organization. Many people today want to climb up the corporate ladder because they believe that freedom, power, and wealth are the prizes waiting at the top. The life of a leader can look glamorous to people on the outside, but the reality is that leadership requires sacrifice. A leader must give up to go up. In recent years, we've observed more than our share of leaders who used and abused their organizations for their personal benefit, and the resulting corporate scandals that came because of their greed and selfishness. The heart of good leadership is sacrifice. If you desire to become the best leader you can be, then you need to be willing to make sacrifices in order to lead well. If that is your desire, then here are some things you need to know about the law of sacrifice. Number 1, there is no success without sacrifice. Every person who has achieved any success in life has made sacrifices to do so. Many working people dedicate 4 or more years and pay thousands of dollars to attend college to get the tools that they'll need before embarking on their career. Athletes sacrifice countless hours in the gym or on the practice field, preparing themselves to perform at a higher level. Parents give up much of their free time and sacrifice their resources in order to do a good job raising their children. Leaders must give up to go up. That's true of every leader, regardless of profession. Talk to leaders and you will find that they have made repeated sacrifices. Effective leaders sacrifice much that is good in order to dedicate themselves to what is best. That's the way the law of sacrifice works. Number 2, leaders are often asked to give up more than others. The heart of leadership is putting others ahead of yourself. It's doing what is best for the team. For that reason, I believe that leaders have to give up their rights. When you have no responsibilities, you can do pretty much anything you want. Once you take on responsibility, you start to experience limitations in what you can do. The more responsibility you accept, the fewer options you have. Everyone who leads gives up other opportunities. Some people have to give up beloved hobbies. Many give up aspects of their personal lives. Some, like Keene, give their actual lives. The circumstances are different from person to person, but the principle doesn't change. Leadership means sacrifice. Number 3, you must keep giving up to stay up. Most people are willing to acknowledge that sacrifices are necessary early in a leadership career in order to make progress. They'll take an undesirable territory to make a name for themselves. They'll move their family to a less desirable city to accept a better position. They'll take a temporary cut in pay for greater opportunities for advancement. The problem for leaders comes when they think they've earned the right to stop making sacrifices. But in leadership, sacrifice is an ongoing process, not a one-time payment. If leaders have to give up to go up, then they have to give up even more to stay up. Have you ever considered how infrequently sports teams have back-to-back championship seasons? The reason is simple. If a leader can win one championship with his team, he often assumes he can duplicate the results the next year by doing the same thing. He becomes reluctant to make additional sacrifices in the off-season to prepare for what is often an even greater challenge the next year. But today's success is the greatest threat to tomorrow's success. And what gets a team to the top isn't what keeps it there. The only way to stay up is to give up even more. Leadership success requires continual change, constant improvement, and ongoing sacrifice. Number 4, the higher the level of leadership, the greater the sacrifice. Have you ever been part of an auction? It's an exciting experience. An item comes up for a bid and everyone in the room gets excited. When the bidding opens, lots of people jump in and take part. But as the price goes higher and higher, what happens? There are fewer and fewer bidders. When the price is low, everyone bids. In the end, only one person is willing to pay the high price that the item actually cost. It's the same in leadership. The higher you go, the more it's going to cost you. And it doesn't matter what kind of leadership career you pick. You will have to make sacrifices. You will have to give up to go up. There can be no success without sacrifice. Anytime you see success, you can be sure someone made sacrifices to make it happen. And as a leader, if you sacrifice, even if you don't witness the success, you can be sure that someone in the future will benefit from what you've given. That was certainly true of Martin Luther King, Jr. He did not live to see most of the benefits of his sacrifices, but many others have. One such person was an African-American girl born in segregated Birmingham, Alabama in 1954. A precocious child, she followed the news of the day, including civil rights struggles. A neighbor recalls that she was always interested in politics because, as a little girl, she used to call me and say things like, "Did you see what Bull Connor did today?" describing the racist city commissioner. She was just a little girl, and she did that all the time. I would have to read the newspaper thoroughly because I wouldn't know what she was going to talk about. Though she had an interest in current events, her passion was music. While other children were out playing, she was studying and practicing the piano. Her parents named her Condoleezza, from the musical notation con dulcezza, which means with sweetness. Her schedule was often grueling. After the family moved to Denver when she was 13, she worked harder and made more sacrifices. She was highly disciplined. To be able to compete in both figure skating and piano competitions, she would get up at 4:30 in the morning to fit everything in. One of her teachers commented, "There was a core of her that revealed she knew what she wanted and was willing to make the sacrifices." I think in her mind, they were not sacrifices, but things to do that were necessary to keep with her goals. And her parents supported her fully and were willing to make sacrifices for her success as well. To assist her in her goals as a pianist, they took out a $13,000 loan in 1969 to buy her a used Steinway grand piano. Rice graduated early from high school and went to the University of Denver with the intention of earning a degree in music and becoming a professional concert pianist. It was something that she had made sacrifices her entire life to do. But after her sophomore year, she realized that if she was going to reach her personal potential, it would not be in music. So she began searching for a new field. She found it in international politics. She was drawn like a magnet to Russian culture and the Soviet government. For the next 2 years, she immersed herself in her courses, did extensive outside reading, and learned the Russian language. She had found her niche, and she was still willing to pay the price to go to the highest level. After graduating with her bachelor's degree, she went on to Notre Dame to get her master's degree. She then returned to the University of Denver and earned a Ph.D. at the age of 26. When she received an offer for a fellowship at Stanford, she jumped at it. A few months later, she was recruited to become a member of the university's faculty. She had arrived. Most people would be happy if the rest of the story played out something like this: publish a few articles, then a book or two, earn tenure, and eventually settle into a comfortable life in the academic community. Not Rice. True, she did carve out a place for herself at Stanford. It was an environment that she loved. She enjoyed the intellectual stimulation. She was a talented teacher who found teaching and counseling students highly rewarding. She even became an avid fan of the university's sports teams. She thrived and received one award after the other. But she spent a year at the Pentagon in an advisory position with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. She called it a reality check. Practical experience that informed her teaching and writing. Then in 1989, the White House called. She was invited to accept a position on the National Security Council as the Director of Soviet and East European Affairs. She took a leave of absence from Stanford, and it turned out to be a wonderful decision. She was President George H.W. Bush's primary advisor on the Soviet Union as that government disintegrated, and she helped in creating policy for the unification of Germany. It made her one of the world's experts on the subject. She returned to Stanford after 2 years in Washington. Back at Stanford, she possessed even greater clout. In 2 years, she was made a full professor at the age of 38. A month later, she was asked to become provost, a position that had never been held by an African American, by a woman, or by anyone so young. As the second in command at one of the world's premier universities, Rice had it made. She had proven herself as an executive. She was already sitting on many corporate boards, and she was in position to become president of any university in the nation. So some people might have been surprised when she stepped down as provost and began tutoring George W. Bush, then governor of Texas, on foreign policy. But it was a sacrifice she was willing to make, one that led her to becoming National Security Advisor and eventually U.S. Secretary of State. As I read this, Rice continues to serve in that role. What once looked like a sacrifice has made her more influential than ever. She has been consistently willing to give up, to go up, and I have no doubt that she will make whatever sacrifices are necessary to take the next step. That's what happens when a leader understands and lives by the law of sacrifice. Law number 19, the law of timing. When to lead is as important as what to do and where to go. If ever there was an example of the importance of timing as it relates to leadership, it came in New Orleans in late August and early September of 2005. On Wednesday, August 24, 2005, nobody in New Orleans could have known that the newly formed tropical storm named Katrina would be the big one. The hurricane the city had feared would someday come. It wasn't until Friday that the National Hurricane Center predicted that the storm would reach landfall on Monday somewhere near Burris, Louisiana, about 60 miles southeast of New Orleans. The hurricane was already looking like a bad one. The next morning, Saturday, August 27th, the leaders of many of Louisiana's parishes around New Orleans ordered mandatory evacuations. St. Charles, Plaquemine, parts of Jefferson, and even St. Tammany, which is situated on higher ground north of New Orleans. But what about New Orleans? Why didn't Mayor Ray Nagin, the leader of the city, order a mandatory evacuation at the same time? Many people say New Orleanians are fatalistic, and they can't be made to move any faster than they want to go. Others say that Nagin, a businessman before he was elected, was worried about the legal and financial implications of an evacuation. I say he and others in government didn't understand the law of timing. When to lead is as important as what to do and where to go. The time to move the people of New Orleans was when the other parish leaders announced their mandatory evacuations. Nagin waited. On Saturday evening, he finally announced a voluntary evacuation of New Orleans. Only after Max Mayfield, the director of the National Hurricane Center, called Nagin on Saturday night did the mayor become concerned enough to act. Max scared the crap out of me, Nagin is reported to have said after the call. The next morning at 9 o'clock, Nagin finally ordered a mandatory evacuation, fewer than 24 hours before the hurricane would make landfall. It was much too late for many citizens of New Orleans. And how did he plan to help those people who couldn't make it out of town on such a short notice? He advised them to get to the Superdome, the city's shelter of last resort, however they could. But he made no real provisions for them. If someone was going to step in and lead, it would have had to occur somewhere other than the local level. Most people began looking to the federal government for leadership, but they violated the law of timing too. Not until Wednesday, August 31, did Director of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff, release a memo declaring Katrina an incident of national significance, a key designation needed to trigger swift federal coordination. President Bush didn't meet with his cabinet until the following day to determine how to launch the White House task force on Hurricane Katrina response. Meanwhile, the people stranded in New Orleans waited for help. On Thursday, September 1, the Red Cross requested permission to take water, food, and supplies to the people who were stranded in the city, but their request was denied by the Louisiana Office of Homeland Security. They were asked to wait another day. Finally, on Sunday, September 4, 6 days after New Orleans flooded, the evacuation of the Superdome was finally complete. The way Katrina was handled shows leadership timing at its worst. It was botched at every level. Good leaders recognize that when to lead is as important as what to do and where to go. Timing is often the difference between success and failure in an endeavor. Every time a leader must make a move, there are really only 4 outcomes. Number 1, the wrong action at the wrong time leads to disaster. A leader who takes the wrong action at the wrong time is sure to suffer negative repercussions. That was certainly the case in New Orleans as Katrina approached. Nagin's poor leadership set in motion a series of wrong actions at the wrong time. He waited until it was too late to call for mandatory evacuation. He sent faxes to local churches, hoping that they would help with evacuating people. But by the time he did so, the people who would have received the faxes were already long gone. He picked a poor location for the shelter of last resort, neglected to supply it properly, and failed to provide adequate transportation for people to get there. One wrong action after another led to disaster. Obviously, the stakes for every leadership decision are not as high as they were for Mayor Nagin. But every leadership situation requires that leaders heed the law of timing. If you lead a department or a small team, and you take the wrong action at the wrong time, your people will suffer, and so will your leadership. Number 2, the right action at the wrong time brings resistance. When it comes to good leadership, having a vision for the direction of the organization or team and knowing how to get there aren't enough. If you take the right action but do it at the wrong time, you may still be unsuccessful because the people you lead can become resistant. Good leadership timing requires many things. Understanding. Leaders must have a firm grasp on the situation. Maturity. If leaders' motives aren't right, their timing will be off. Confidence. People follow leaders who know what must be done. Decisiveness. Wishy-washy leaders create wishy-washy followers. Experience. If leaders don't possess experience, then they need to gain wisdom from others who do possess it. Intuition. Timing often depends on intangibles such as momentum and morale. Preparation. If the conditions aren't right, leaders must create those conditions. Without all of those things, timing is bound to be off. Number 3, the wrong action at the right time is a mistake. People who are naturally entrepreneurial often possess a strong sense of timing. They intuitively know when it's time to make a move, to seize an opportunity. They sometimes make mistakes in their actions at those key moments. My brother, Larry, who is an excellent businessman, has coached me in this area. Larry says the greatest mistake made by entrepreneurs and other people in business is knowing when to cut their losses or when to increase their investment to maximize their gains. Their mistakes come from taking the wrong action at the right time. Number 4, the right action at the right time results in success. When the right leader and the right timing come together, incredible things happen. An organization achieves its goals, reaps incredible rewards, and gains momentum. Success almost becomes inevitable. If you look at the history of nearly any organization, you will find a pivotal moment when the right leader took the right action at the right time and it transformed the organization. When the stakes are high, the consequences of the law of timing are dramatic and immediate. That is certainly true in war. In any major battle, the critical importance of timing becomes evident. The Battle of Gettysburg during the American Civil War is a prime example. When Confederate General Robert E. Lee took the Army of Northern Virginia into Pennsylvania in late June of 1863, it was the third year of the war, and both the Union and the Confederacy were growing weary of this conflict. Several days prior to the battle, Lee told General Trimble, "I have not yet heard that the enemy have crossed the Potomac, and am waiting to hear from General Stuart. When they hear where they are, they will make forced marches. They will come up, broken down from hunger and hard marching, strung out on a long line and much demoralized when they come to Pennsylvania. I shall throw an overwhelming force on their advance, crush it, follow up the success, drive one corps back into the other, and by successive repulses and surprises, before they can concentrate, create a panic, and virtually destroy the army." Lee was trying to seize the opportunity for overwhelming victory. He didn't know until the morning of July 1 that the Union Army had already moved north. By then, some of its forces were already engaging Confederate troops on Chambersburg Road west of Gettysburg. That development disrupted Lee's strategy and ruined his timing. Lee's first instinct was to hold back and wait for his army's full strength to assemble before forcing a major engagement. But always conscious of the importance of timing, he recognized when his troops had sudden advantage. As Lee watched from a nearby ridge, he saw that Federal troops were being routed and retreating. There was still a chance to take action that could lead to victory. Confederate forces could attack and seize the high ground of Cemetery Hill, defended only by a few Union infantry reserves and artillery. In position to take that hill was Confederate General R.S. Ewell. It was still early in the day, and if Ewell moved forward, he could take it. But instead of pressing his advantage when the time was ripe and engaging the enemy, Ewell simply watched. He let the opportunity slip away, and the Confederates didn't take Cemetery Hill. By the next morning, Union troops had reinforced their previous positions, and the South's chance was gone. President Lincoln recognized that the timing was right. The Union Army could crush what was left of the Confederate forces and could end the war. But just as the Southern forces did not seize the moment for victory when it was available to them, neither did their Northern counterparts. General Meade took his time following up his victory at Gettysburg, and he didn't pursue Lee aggressively enough. Lincoln knew he was seeing the Union's chance slip away, and he was right. What remained of the Army of Northern Virginia crossed over the Potomac, escaping destruction, and the war continued for almost 2 more years, and hundreds of thousands more troops died. Leaders from both sides had known what to do to achieve victory, but they failed to follow through at the critical moment. Reading the situation and knowing what to do are not enough to make you succeed in leadership. If you want your organization, department, or team to move forward, you must pay attention to timing. Only the right action at the right time will bring success. Anything else exacts a high price. No leader can escape the law of timing. Law number 20, the law of explosive growth. To add growth, lead followers. To multiply, lead leaders. In 1990, I traveled to a country in South America with my wife, Margaret, to teach leadership in a national conference. I could tell my comments were not connecting with them. They didn't engage, and what I was trying to communicate didn't seem to make an impact. The people I spoke to didn't understand leadership, and they had no desire to learn anything about it. For someone like me who believes that everything rises and falls on leadership, it drove me crazy. This wasn't the first time I had experienced such frustration. I noticed that whenever I traveled to developing countries, I faced similar situations. I suspect that in nations where there is no strong business infrastructure and where government doesn't allow its citizens much freedom, it is difficult for leaders to develop. On the flight home, I talked to Margaret about my frustrations. I finally summed it up saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I traveled thousands of miles just to counsel people on petty conflicts. If they would just turn their attention to becoming leaders, it would change their lives. After listening patiently, Margaret replied, maybe you're the one who's supposed to do something about this. Margaret's exhortation to do something about the leadership problems I had seen overseas stirred something within me. For the next several years, I reflected on the issue and thought about possible solutions. Finally, in 1996, I decided what I would do. I brought together a group of leaders to help me create a not-for-profit organization to develop leaders in government, education, and religious community. I named it EQUIP, which stands for Encouraging Qualities Undeveloped in People. We would try to develop 1 million leaders around the globe by 2008. How could a small nonprofit organization hope to accomplish such a feat? By using the law of explosive growth. EQUIP's strategy, which came to be called the Million Leader Mandate, was to develop 40,000 leaders in countries around the world. Those leaders would attend a training session every 6 months in a city near them for 3 years. The only thing that would be asked of them in return was that they commit to personally develop 25 leaders in their own city, town, or village. EQUIP would provide the training material for the 40,000 leaders it trained, and it would provide material for the 25 leaders each of them would be developing. If the strategy succeeded, we would develop 1 million leaders. It was an ambitious plan. The question was, would it work? I'll give you the answer to that question later in this chapter. You can grow by leading followers, but if you want to maximize your leadership and help your organization reach its potential, you need to develop leaders. There is no other way to experience explosive growth. Becoming a leader who develops leaders requires an entirely different focus and attitude from simply attracting and leading followers. It takes a different mindset. When you're leading a group of people, who typically ask for the most time and attention? The weakest ones in the group. If you allow them to, they will consume 80% or more of your time. However, proactive leaders who practice the law of explosive growth don't allow that bottom 20% to take all their time. They seek out the best 20%, the people with the greatest leadership potential, and they invest their time developing them. They know that if they develop the best will help with the rest. There's a myth in some leadership circles that promotes the idea of treating everyone the same for the sake of fairness. What a mistake. As Mick Delaney says, any business or industry that pays equal rewards to its goof-offs and its eager beavers sooner or later will find itself with more goof-offs than eager beavers. Leaders who develop leaders give rewards, resources, and responsibility based on results. The greater the impact of leaders, the greater the opportunities they receive. Leaders who attract followers but never develop leaders get tired. Why? Because they themselves must deal with every person under their authority. Being able to impact only the people you can touch personally is very limiting. In contrast, leaders who develop leaders impact people far beyond their personal reach. If developing leaders has such a great impact, then why doesn't everyone do it? Because it's hard. Leadership development isn't an add water and stir proposition. It takes a lot of time, energy, and resources. Once you find leaders, drawing them in can be very difficult. They're entrepreneurial and want to go on their own way. If you try to recruit them, they want to know where you're going, how you plan to get there, who else you're planning to take with you, and whether they can drive. What you're doing has to be more compelling than what they're already doing. On top of that, your organization needs to create an environment that is attractive to them. That is often not the case. Most organizations desire stability. Leaders want excitement. Most organizations desire structure. Leaders want flexibility. Most organizations place a high value on following rules. Leaders want to think outside the box. If you want to gather leaders, you must create a place where they can thrive. As hard as it is to find and gather good leaders, it's even more difficult to keep them. The only way to lead leaders is to become a better leader yourself. If you keep growing and stay ahead of the people you lead, you will be able to keep adding value to the leaders who follow you. Your goals must be to keep developing them so that they can realize their potential. Only a leader can do that for another leader because it takes a leader to raise up another leader. If you keep adding value to the leaders you lead, then they will be willing to stay with you. Do that long enough and they may never want to leave. Convinced that developing leaders was the key to reaching our goal of training 1 million leaders, Equip launched the MLN, Million Leaders Mandate Initiative, in 2002 in several cities in India, Indonesia, and the Philippines. We had chosen those areas because we had the best contacts there and had experienced success there in previous years. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of hungry leaders traveled to each site to engage in the 2-day training. Some attendees spent as many as 5 days walking to get to the event. And at the end of the training, when we asked attendees to commit to developing 25 leaders over the next 3 years using the materials that we would give them, more than 90% of the attendees signed on. With the first success under our belt, we moved forward. The next year, we began training leaders in other parts of Asia and the Middle East. In 2004, we started training in Africa, in 2005, Europe, and in 2006, South America. In some cities, we had very modest success, with a few dozen leaders attending the training. In other cities, people came by the hundreds. Many leaders were able to commit to developing 25 leaders. Some could commit to training only 5 or 10, but others were training 100, 200, or 250 in their towns and cities. As I mentioned, we wanted to reach our goal of training 1 million leaders by 2008. At times, it was a struggle. In some countries, we had a difficult time gaining credibility. In others, it took us a long time to make connections with leaders. But to our great surprise and delight, in the spring of 2006, we reached our goal, 2 years ahead of schedule. Now, what seemed to be an impossible goal seems modest. In 2007, we trained our second million, and we launched an initiative to develop 5 million leaders in the next 5 years. My hope and prayer are that before I'm finished, Equip and its partners will train 50 million leaders around the globe. That's explosive growth. Leaders who develop leaders experience an incredible multiplication effect in their organizations that can be achieved in no other way, not by increasing resources, reducing costs, increasing profit margins, improving systems, implementing quality procedures, or doing anything else. The only way to experience an explosive level of growth is to do the math. Leaders' math. That's the incredible power of the law of explosive growth. Law 21, the law of legacy. A leader's lasting value is measured by succession. What do you want people to say at your funeral? That may seem like an odd question, but it may be the most important thing that you can ask yourself as a leader. Most people never consider it. And that's not good, because if they don't, their lives and leadership can take a direction different from that of their greatest potential and impact. If you want your leadership to really have meaning, you need to take into account the law of legacy. Why? Because a leader's lasting value is measured by succession. Clare Boothe Luce, the writer, politician, and ambassador, popularized the idea of the life sentence, a statement summarizing the goal and the purpose of one's life. When I started in my career in the late 1960s, my life sentence could have been expressed as, I want to be a great pastor. Several years later, as I worked and realized my shortcomings as a speaker, my sentence changed to be, I want to be a great communicator. For more than a decade, improving my speaking skills became a major focus. However, when I reached my early 30s, I realized that if all I ever did was speak, my impact would always be limited. There are only so many days in a year and so many people who will come to an event to hear you. I wanted to reach more people than that. That's when I decided I want to be a great writer. But when I reached my 40s, my focus changed again. And that's when I decided I want to become a great leader. I wanted to build and lead organizations that could make a difference. I've discovered that at every stage of my life, I've grown and my world has gotten bigger. As the result, my life sentence has changed. When I was in my late 50s, I thought about all of the previous statements I had embraced, and I realized that they all had a common denominator: adding value to others. That was really my desire. I wanted to be an effective pastor, communicator, writer, and leader so that I could help people. Now that I've turned 60, I finally settled on the life sentence that I believe will serve me the rest of my days. When they hold my funeral, I hope I will have lived a life that prompts people to know why I was here. And they won't have to guess at it. My sentence is, I want to add value to leaders who will multiply value to others. Why is it so important to pay attention to your life sentence? Because your life sentence not only sets the direction for your life, but it also determines the legacy that you will leave. We have a choice about the legacy we will leave, and we must work and be intentional to leave the legacy we want. Most people simply accept their lives. They don't lead them. I believe people need to be proactive about how they live, and I believe that is especially true of leaders. A legacy lives on in people, not things. Too often leaders put their energy into organizations, buildings, systems, or other lifeless objects. But only people live on after we are gone. Everything else is temporary. There's often a natural progression to how leaders develop the area of legacy, starting with the desire to achieve. Achievement comes when they do big things by themselves. Success comes when they empower followers to do big things for them. Significance comes when they develop leaders to do great things with them. Legacy comes when they put leaders in position to do great things without them. Just about anybody can make an organization look good for a moment by launching a flashy new program or product, drawing crowds to a big event, or slashing the budget to boost the bottom line. But leaders who leave a legacy take a different approach. They take the long view. Author, educator, and theologian Elton Trueblood wrote, "We have made at least a start in discovering the meaning in human life when we plant a shade tree under which we know full well we will never sit." The best leaders lead today with tomorrow in mind by making sure that they invest in leaders who will carry their legacy forward. Why? Because a leader's lasting value is measured by succession. That is the law of legacy. Conclusion: everything rises and falls on leadership. Well, there you have them. The 21 irrefutable laws of leadership. Learn them, take them to heart, and apply them to your life. If you follow them, people will follow you. I wish you great leadership success. Pursue your dreams. Strive for excellence. Become the person you were created to be, and accomplish all that you were put on this earth to do. Leadership will help you do that. Learn to lead, not just for yourself, but for the people who will follow you. And as you reach the highest levels, don't forget to take others with you to be the leaders of tomorrow.
That concludes the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership by John C. Maxwell. Copyright 2007, published by Thomas Nelson. Dr. John C. Maxwell is an internationally recognized leadership expert, speaker, and author who has sold over 12 million books. His organizations have trained more than 1 million leaders worldwide. Dr. Maxwell is the founder of Enjoy Stewardship Services and Equip. Every year, he speaks to Fortune 500 companies, international government leaders, and organizations as diverse as the United States Military Academy at West Point and the National Football League. Look for the complete, unabridged 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership book in bookstores everywhere, as well as other books and audio programs by John C. Maxwell, including The Difference Maker, Talent is Never Enough, and The 360-Degree Leader.